FNNC Publishing is blessed to present the first book to dispel the stigma of slave. This is the paradigm shift we have been waiting for. May we honor our ancestors in truth and spirit. I thank my ancestors. I thank my ancestors for the here and now. I know I could not be here without them. I thank my parents who are related to my ancestors. I know they have done the best that they know how. Even though it may seem like I am in hell, my ancestors have provided a sanctuary for me and those like me. They have proven that they love me more than I love myself. No healing can take place until the illness is acknowledged and understood. Contents for Part 3. Why we shouldn't call our ancestors slaves? Reason 1. The definition does not fit. It is a bogus word, slave. Resistance, a battle of wills. The effect of our resistance. Abolitionists. The gag rule. The Civil War. The Emancipation Proclamation. Why we shouldn't call our ancestors slaves. The following is a quote by Anthony Browder in his book, Survival Strategies, 13 Steps to Freedom. Quote, Africans in America should never be ashamed of the indignities that our ancestors were forced to endure during enslavement. We should never refer to them as slaves, for they were human beings who were enslaved by others of a subhuman nature. Unquote. Anthony Browder, Survival Strategies, 13 Steps to Freedom. Reason 1. The definition does not fit. To paraphrase Johnny Cochran, if the definition don't fit, we must acquit. There are 2 reasons why the definition does not fit. Number 1. It is a bogus word as it is applied to Africans in America living in slavery. And 2, because of our steadfast resistance to slavery. It is a bogus word, slave. It is a bogus word as it is applied to Africans in slavery. One concept that makes the word slave bogus is found in the Declaration of Independence, termed as unalienable rights. It refers to the nature of human beings and our God-given rights. The Declaration of Independence. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, unquote. What does self-evident mean? It means you should be able to see it for yourself. The only way not to see it is if one has been blinded. The Declaration is saying that you should already know and understand this truth, and if you don't see it, they are not going to explain it to you. They knew we were human. By this statement in the Declaration alone, the powers that be should have known that the word slave was a bogus word and slavery was a bogus process. Therefore, to make slavery acceptable, they had to say that black people were not human beings and could only be counted as 3/5 of a person for political reasons. However, they knew that the people they were holding as slaves were men and women, human beings. What are unalienable rights? They are God-given rights that no human being can take away. They cannot be given away. They cannot be accidentally or unknowingly lost. The people who put us in slavery knew that all human beings have unalienable rights. They are intrinsic to the human spirit. Could the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence not have known the meaning of the words unalienable rights? It is impossible to be a slave or to make someone a slave as defined by the original and adjusted definitions, because it is impossible to take away unalienable rights. It is impossible to make a human being wholly subject to the will of another and to divest a person of all freedom and personal rights. And it is not possible by the laws of nature for one human being to own another as property as long as that human being has a will and is alive. Note, just as no one is totally devoid of freedom, no one is totally free if we must live by rules and regulations. We are free to do things or free not to do things. When people say, "I am free," or "I want my freedom," the rest of the meaning is implied. However, to argue the point, it is possible to limit people's choices by manipulating their environment. It is possible to get them to do something that they do not want to do, especially if you threaten them with suffering, pain, and death. It is possible to trick and deceive people into believing and doing things that are not good for them. Even if all this happened, this would not make a person a slave. In short, no matter what situation people are placed in, they still have unalienable rights and cannot be divested of all personal rights and freedom. Resistance, a battle of wills. Do you believe black people were docile under slavery? To call them slaves is to say or imply that their nature under slavery was inferior to their captors. One of the key phrases in the definition of the word slave is the lost power of resistance. We have been taught that while the so-called slave masters were saying, "Give me liberty or give me death," we were submitting to slavery without any type of noteworthy resistance. Because of the pressure, slavery brought out every bit of genius that was in our ancestors. And when the time was right, their actions sent out a vibration of fear to all plantations and farm owners throughout the country. This fear was so prominent that a word was developed to describe it: Negrophobia. We resisted on the boats, we resisted in the seasoning camps, we resisted in the house, and we resisted in the fields. Before the culture mind transplant was in full effect, our ancestors fought hard to maintain their African identity and spiritual connections. When they had a chance, they would sneak away and pray to God, their personal gods, and ancestor spirits to help them get out of the situation they were in. Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, Ida B. Wells, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Frederick Douglass were only the tip of the iceberg of resistance. To this day, the story of our resistance has been suppressed, grossly undertold, and not recognized as it should be. It has been watered down to conform to the belief that our ancestors were slaves by those who look at our history through Eurocentric eyes, especially during the antebellum days of slavery. The plantation and farm owners did not want Africans in slavery to know about the amount of resistance, especially the violent resistance that was happening on other plantations and farms. They tried to keep us from knowing because they did not want us to become inspired and more motivated to resist. And they particularly did not want us to see their fear. However, plantation and farm owners needed to know what Africans were doing on other plantations because it helped them in predicting what could happen on their own plantation or farm. Clearly, this kind of news was of vital interest to all farmers and plantation owners. They had to tell it in the newspapers, but they needed to keep us from knowing. That was one more reason why they did not want us to learn how to read, write, or educate ourselves. You know it had to be front page news. Africans go wild on plantation, killing everybody. Under slavery, our ancestors acted no different than we would have acted under those conditions. Because we have been told and shown over and over that they were docile under slavery, it has made it difficult for us to identify with them. Because we live in a Eurocentric culture, the story of our resistance has been grossly understated. This is a very different picture than what most of us have been taught in the public school system or on TV. The more we resisted, the more the so-called slave masters felt that it was necessary to make tougher laws and to inflict greater punishment. However, their reaction to our resistance generated more resistance. Because of the pressure and the will to be free from the despotism of slavery, in one way or another, every black person at that time was involved in some form of resistance to slavery. Of course, there were many forms of resistance, and our genius showed when it came to coping with slavery. John Hope Franklin, in From Slavery to Freedom, A History of Negro Americans, 1980, writes, quote, "Resistance could be found wherever the institution of slavery existed, and Negro slavery in the United States was no exception. Self-mutilation and suicide were popular forms of resistance to slavery. Slaves, fresh from Africa, committed suicide in great numbers. Sometimes, slave mothers killed their own children to prevent them from growing up in slavery." Unquote. The logic behind this type of behavior is that they felt hopeless and saw no way out. Death was better than slavery. Why else would self-mutilation and suicide, self-destructive behavior, become a popular form of resistance? Is it possible that we are experiencing high rates of self-destructive behavior for the same reasons? John Hope Franklin goes on to say, quote, "Much more disturbing to the South were the numerous instances of slaves doing violence to the master class. The times that overseers and masters were killed by slaves in the woods or fields were exceedingly numerous, as the careful reading of almost any Southern newspaper will reveal. The practice of running away became so widespread that every state sought to strengthen its patrol and other safeguards, but to little avail. Revolts or conspiracies to revolt persisted down to 1865. They began with the institution and did not end until slavery was abolished." Unquote. John Hope Franklin, From Slavery to Freedom. Does this sound like a people who did not have the power to resist? Does it sound like a people who were totally controlled by another? Lerone Bennet Jr., in his book Before the Mayflower, in the chapter Slave Revolts and Insurrections, also writes about what was written during that time. Quote, "In an instant," a writer said, 1,200 coffee and 200 sugar plantations were in flames. The buildings, the machinery, the farmhouses were reduced to ashes, and the unfortunate proprietors were hunted down, murdered, or thrown into the flames by infuriated Negroes. More than 100,000 slaves were in revolt, hacking, burning, and murdering. For 3 weeks, the slaves continued the work of death. The slaves smiled, yes, but he also cut throats, burned down houses, and conceived plots to kill every white person within reach. This happened so often that many whites weakened under the strain. Some died of heart failure. Some went insane. These insurrections, a Virginian wrote during the period of panic, have alarmed my wife so as to really endanger her health, and I have not slept without anxiety in 3 months." Unquote. Lerone Bennet Jr. before the Mayflower. What made them believe they could turn human beings into slaves? What made them think they could keep human beings in slavery forever? Did they free the slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation? How much did the conditions for black people change after the Emancipation Proclamation? The effects of our resistance. Negrophobia. Back then, the African people generated so much fear that it became a definable term. Negrophobia, the fear of Negroes. Initially, this fear was based on our reaction to slavery, and this phobia still exists in some white people to this very day. Fear and ignorance are the underlying drives of racism in America today. Was slavery broken, or did they just improve on it, or both? The system had to be changed because slavery and our resistance to it had become a health hazard to America. It was like a chain reaction. The gag rule, talk of emancipation, the secession of states from the Union, the Civil War, and the Emancipation Proclamation. Our widespread resistance caused them to start talking about ending slavery. Under slavery, there would be no peace. It couldn't be said out loud, but the talk about the emancipation was only about changing the look of slavery. Otherwise, black people would know that slavery had not ended, but only changed. If we believed we were free, we would see no reason to seek freedom. What happened after the Emancipation Proclamation is clear proof that America did not free us, but only changed the look of the process of control. The abolitionist. The history books clearly show that President Lincoln and the abolitionists did not identify with or have much compassion for the black African people. The churches, the schools, and their businesses clearly reflected their philosophies and beliefs about black people. Most abolitionists made it clear that they were not against slavery because they had compassion for Africans or Africans in slavery. They were against slavery because of the havoc that came with it and its immorality. The gag rule. Slavery had become a mental and physical health hazard to America. On the mental side, Congress was locked up with debates and petitions over slavery. It took up too much of their time, and they were being overwhelmed by petitions about slavery. So, in 1836, they passed the gag rule, which threatened the freedom of speech for all citizens by barring discussions and petitions about slavery in Congress. If you can do it for slavery, then what would be next? This was the question in the back of their minds. As a result, politicians who had retired came out of the woodwork with outrage. The gag rule threw the government into a tizzy and brought it one step closer to the Civil War. The Civil War. Almost all fights start with an argument, and the one over slavery was the biggest ever. On top of changing slavery, there was the 3/5 of a man argument. Since black people were not considered to be human, the southern states wanted to count them as 3/5 of a person. Doing so would give the southern states greater power in Congress by increasing their representation. The northern states thought it would give the southern states an unfair advantage. After they got over the gag rule fiasco, not long before the Civil War, there was talk in the government and in politics of ending slavery, at least changing its form. This talk caused southern states to secede from the Union. As the states began to secede from the Union, President Lincoln declared, "A house divided cannot stand." As with the concept of many gangs, blood in, blood out, America would not be a house divided. The argument was over slavery. The fight was over states leaving the Union because of slavery. Therefore, the Civil War was about the control of black people. To this day, most Eurocentric historians would not admit what the Civil War was really about. This war is noted as the bloodiest war America has ever fought. They did not fight a civil war because they wanted to protect and rescue black people. The Civil War began in 1861 and ended in 1865. The Emancipation Proclamation. They had to change the look and condition of slavery because of black African people's resistance to slavery. Our resistance to slavery clearly proves that we were not slaves. They knew slavery was inhumane and immoral when they instituted it. They called it a necessary evil. They did not come up with the Emancipation Proclamation out of the kindness of their hearts. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation, the new trick, things did not change that much for black Africans in the South. However, the burning and killing by black Africans was greatly reduced. Many stayed where they were because they had no place to go. Even if they did have somewhere to go, the South was not about to let them go. Since it was no longer legal to hold black people against their will, organizations like the KKK used terrorist tactics to hold black people in the South. Because not much had changed since slavery or before the Emancipation Proclamation. From 1916 to 1970, 6 million black people were highly motivated to migrate to the North by any means necessary. When we found out there were plenty of jobs in the northern cities, nothing could stop us. Black migrators gave new meaning to the term fly by night. According to the blackpast.org, quote, "The Great Migration, one of the largest internal migrations in the history of the United States, changed forever the urban North, the rural South, African America, and in many respects, the entire nation," unquote. We went from plantations and farms in the South to inner city ghettos and factories in the North, from fighting slavery in the South to riots and protesting racism and segregation in the North. And today, we are provoked to declare Black Lives Matter. If the word slave was not a bogus word, the fact of our resistance also shows the error of calling our ancestors slaves. With just a little searching, we can find overwhelming information that tells the story of our great influence on America. We must guide our own education when it comes to learning about who we are, our history, and our cultures. This system, which is rooted in slavery, is not educating us about us for our benefit. If we only know what we have been taught in school, what we have seen in the movies and on television, we will be led to believe that we are inferior and that others control our freedom. This is the end of part 3. In part 4, We will look at reason 2 of why we shouldn't call our ancestors slaves. We will look at the effect that calling our ancestors slaves has on the esteem, self-esteem, and image of American Africans and on how others view us as a people. Thank you for listening and watching. If you like this video audio book, please press the like icon and share. See what your friends think. Please subscribe to this channel so that you will be notified when more videos come available. Also, your comments are most welcome.